So I hope Israel doesn't continue to take the position that there's no limits on what they can do to Palestinian civilians, but right now that is their posture. And that's why what happened today at the UN is so important. The Secretary General of the UN today stood up and gave a speech on the situation in the Middle East, which is what he is there to do. And here's some of what he said. Here's the official UN Secretary General page. Quote, "The situation in the Middle East is growing more dire by the hour. The war in Gaza is raging and risks spilling throughout the region. Divisions are splintering societies. Tensions threaten to boil over." And what he's saying there is, by the way, that you have to notice this. It's not just in Israel and Gaza. In the United States, the discourse is so hateful, so entrenched with tribal vitriol, to the point where people are eager to get rid of free speech. They're saying ban basic civil rights for Palestinians, including Palestinian Americans or Palestinian Europeans. No free speech for them, no protest for them. Have the FBI investigate them. These are savages in our midst trying to kill all Jews. So it's spilling over, and that's what the UN Security General Secretary was saying. I just hit my monitor and caused the graphic on the screen to fall. There, it's back. So that's what he's talking about there when he says divisions are splintering societies, tensions threaten to boil over. He's talking about the conflict going into Europe and the United States as well. And then he continues, quote, "At a crucial moment like this, it is vital to be clear on principles, starting with the fundamental principle of respecting and protecting civilians. I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented October 7th acts of terror by Hamas in Israel." And in case you think there's anything ambiguous about what he said, "I have condemned unequivocally the horrifying and unprecedented attack by Hamas. Nothing can justify the deliberate killing, injuring, and kidnapping of civilians, or the launching of rockets against civilian targets." Does that sound in any way relativistic or ambiguous to you when it comes to condemning what Hamas did? No, it does not. It was a condemnation, period. And then he goes on, quote, "All hostages must be treated humanely and released immediately and without conditions. I respectfully note the presence among us of members of their families." And this is what he then went on to say that enraged the Israelis to the point that they're now threatening not to allow anyone from the UN into their country and calling the UN basically anti-Semitic spreaders of blood libels. This is all he said after that passage I just read to you. Quote, "It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced, and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing." All of which is unquestionably true. And then he still goes on to say, knowing that his responsibility is not to say anything to justify what Hamas did, which he does not do, is he then goes on to say, "But the grievances of the Palestinian people cannot justify the appalling attacks by Hamas." So he said it a second time. He said, no matter what you think of those grievances, nothing can justify what Hamas did, and those appalling attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. So he's saying what Hamas did is inexcusable no matter what context you consider, but that also doesn't justify collective punishment. He then went on, "Excellencies, even war has rules. We must demand that all parties uphold and respect their obligations under international humanitarian law, take constant care in the conduct of military operations to spare civilians, and respect and protect hospitals and respect the inviolability of UN facilities, which today are sheltering more than 600,000 Palestinians." 600,000 Palestinians, that's 1/4 of the Palestinian population, are in UN refugee camps. The relentless bombardment of Gaza by Israeli forces, the level of civilian casualties, and the wholesale destruction of neighborhoods continue to mount and are deeply alarming. The protection of civilians is paramount in any armed conflict. Protecting civilians can never mean using them as human shields. Protecting civilians does not mean ordering more than 1 million people to evacuate to the south, where there is no shelter, no food, no water, no medicine, and no fuel, and then continuing to bomb the south itself. I am deeply concerned about the clear violations of international humanitarian law that we are witnessing in Gaza. I regard that speech as perfect. It tracks more or less the trajectory of what we've been saying on the show, starting off for the first several days and focusing on the Hamas attack, and not just saying as lip service, but constructing an argument for why what Hamas did can't be justified. You just can't have a moral standard that allows people to go to a musical festival and gun down civilians, no matter how enraged you are by the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians over decades. And that's what he said, and that's what the UN chief should say. But he then went on to say that what is subsequently happening in Gaza is a form of collective punishment and violation of humanitarianism. And it is. And no matter how much you love Israel, no matter how much you support Israel, loving and supporting a country does not mean refusing to criticize its government. I'm sure most of you have criticized the United States government at times. We just watched the new Speaker of the House accuse the FBI and the CIA of being deeply corrupted and politicized. That doesn't mean he's anti-American. It means he's pro-American. That's the kind of criticism that you launch when you care about your country. If you care about Israel, even if you don't care about Gaza, you have an interest in insisting that it not completely lose its soul, that it adhere to humanitarian principles and international law, and in its rage and quest for vengeance, not just exterminate Palestinians without end, which is what is happening. That is what's happening. Israel heard that speech, that incredibly balanced speech that I'm sure made Palestinians angry as well, and its supporters. And this is what happened from AP. Israel accuses UN chief of justifying terrorism for saying Hamas attack didn't happen in a vacuum. The speech went out of its way multiple times to say terrorism of the kind Hamas carried out can never be justified under any circumstances. And yet, quote, Israeli officials were outraged Wednesday over UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres' comment that the deadly Hamas attack on southern Israel, quote, did not happen in a vacuum, calling it justification for terrorism. This is exactly what happened after 9/11. You had a few people brave enough, willing to stand up, like Ron Paul and Noam Chomsky, and say what happened on 9/11 was horrific. You cannot attack civilians this way, but we should think about as Americans what we've been doing in that part of the world that might have caused it. And they were accused of being pro-terrorist, when in fact they were just trying to get Americans to see the truth about the causal connection between our actions and those, what the CIA calls blowback. The UN Secretary, of course, has to put this in context and call on both sides who are violating humanitarian law in certain ways. He didn't justify terrorism. And yet, quote, Foreign Minister Eli Cohen of Israel canceled a scheduled meeting with Guterres while Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust memorial, said the UN chief, quote, failed the test. Quote, I will not meet with the UN Secretary General after the October 7th massacre. There is no place for a balanced approach. Hamas must be erased off the face of the planet, Cohen posted Tuesday on social media platform X, formerly known as Twitter. Quote, we refuse to grant visas to UN representatives. We have already refused to give one to Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs Martin Griffith, Erdogan told Army Radio, accusing Guterres of justifying a slaughter. Quote, it's time to teach them a lesson. The slaughter of Jews by Hamas on October 7th was genocidal in its intent and immeasurably brutal in its form. Yad Vashem chairman Danny Dayan said in a statement, he said that it tests the sincerity of world leaders who came to Yad Vashem and pledged, quote, never again. Quote, those who seek to understand look for a justifying context, do not condemn the perpetrators, and do not call for the unconditional and immediate release of the abducted failed the test. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres failed the test. Look at how deceitful they are. Those who do not condemn the perpetrators. He condemned Hamas, the perpetrators, in multiple ways in unambiguous and emphatic and unconditional expression. Those who do not call for the immediate and unconditional release of the abducted. He explicitly did exactly that. That's who fails the test, they said, and he failed the test. What really failing the test means is uttering an ounce of criticism of Israel. That is prohibited, that is banned, that cannot be permitted. That is the framework Israel is attempting to impose on the world. If you dislike the Holocaust, if you are sincere in your vow that the Holocaust will never happen again, you will refrain from criticizing not only what we've done in the past, but what we're doing in the present. That is an arrogance that everyone should reject. Israel is playing not only with fire in its country, but in the world. They are relying on funds and military support from multiple other countries around the world. They do not have the right to turn around and say, we don't accept any criticism of our country. Now, here is an article from The Guardian about what happened here. And you see the headline, Israel to refuse visas to UN representatives over Guterres' speech on Gaza war. That's pretty much what we just showed you. Here is the ambassador to the UN speaking on this.
His speech at the Security Council by saying that Hamas attacks did not happen in a vacuum. This is really something that every decent person, it should be unfathomable for each and every one of us. Mr. Secretary General, the UN was established to prevent atrocities, to prevent such atrocities like the barbaric atrocities that Hamas committed. But the UN is failing. The UN is failing, and you, Mr. Secretary General, have lost all morality and impartiality. Because when you say those terrible words that these heinous attacks did not happen in a vacuum, you are tolerating terrorism. And by tolerating terrorism, you are justifying terrorism.
Sorry, that is pathetic. That is a pathetic attempt to prohibit and place off limits criticism of Israel. That's why I read so much of the UN Secretary General's speech. He could not have been more emphatic. Obviously, he understands the situation. He knows what the debate is about and what people are going to accuse him of. And so he went out of his way to do exactly that which they're now claiming he didn't do. How is it that you can give a speech saying over and over what Hamas did is inexcusable? It doesn't matter how much criticism you have of Israel, nothing justifies what Hamas did. They must immediately and unconditionally release all these hostages. Nothing justifies terrorism. And then have the Israelis turn around and say he's justifying terrorism because he also criticized us. Don't fall for that. So many people were intimidated by exactly this sort of bullying behavior in the wake of 9/11. Any peep of protest against the Bush and Cheney administration, any suggestion that the United States has to look inward to understand why its behavior provoked those attacks was deemed to be an apology for terrorism or even being on the side of Al-Qaeda. And so many people were bullied into silence. And in that silence arose abuses that brought moral shame and immense destruction to our country. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.